Do you honestly think the green revolution was designed to save your future? Look at the cars on your street right now. Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, the pride of the West. Now imagine them all gone, replaced by something quieter, something cheaper, something Chinese. But hold on, don't click away, because what I am about to tell you is going to make you question every headline you have read for the last 10 years. The transition to electric vehicles wasn't a mistake, it was a calculated trap. And Europe didn't just walk into it, they built the cage themselves. We are not watching a climate transition, we are watching the industrial murder of the Western economy. And the weapon? It isn't a missile, it is a battery. Stop looking at the tanks in Ukraine. The real war for your future is already over, and the West lost.
For over a century, the global auto industry was an impenetrable fortress, and Europe held the only key. That key was the internal combustion engine. Think about what a traditional engine actually is. It is a masterpiece of controlled explosions. It requires thousands of moving parts, machined to the microscopic millimeter, operating safely at extreme temperatures. You don't just wake up one day and decide to build a better V8 than Mercedes or a more reliable diesel than Volkswagen. It takes decades of deep institutional knowledge. It requires a supply chain of highly specialized engineers that only existed in places like Stuttgart, Munich, and Turin. China knew this. For 20 years, Beijing tried to build gas-powered cars to compete with the West. And for 20 years, they failed miserably. Their traditional cars were mocked on the global stage. The engines were weak, the transmissions were clunky, and they couldn't crack the European market if they begged. The European moat was simply too deep. So Beijing made a chillingly brilliant calculation. If you cannot breach the fortress, you convince the enemy to tear down their own walls. Enter the European Union's 2035 combustion engine ban. Framed by politicians as a glorious crusade to save the planet, bureaucrats in Brussels willingly signed the death warrant of their own greatest industry. With the stroke of a pen, they outlawed the very technology that made the West untouchable. They forced their legacy automakers to stop perfecting the engine and pivot entirely to something new. But here is the fatal flaw no one in Europe wanted to admit. An electric vehicle isn't a car. It is a smartphone on wheels. You do not need 100 years of mechanical engineering to build one. You just need software, a motor, and a massive battery. By banning the combustion engine, Europe erased a century of their own advantage overnight. They leveled the playing field. And while European politicians were busy patting themselves on the back for saving the climate, China was quietly positioning itself to own the one component that now mattered. Europe didn't just surrender their crown. They handed China the exact weapon needed to conquer them.
There is a saying in geopolitics: amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics. While European politicians were busy writing press releases about saving the ozone layer, the Chinese Communist Party was quietly buying up the Earth's crust, literally. An electric vehicle requires a very specific recipe. You need lithium, you need cobalt, you need graphite. You don't just find these materials lying around. You have to mine them, transport them, and most importantly, refine them into battery-grade chemicals. A decade ago, China realized that whoever controls this refining process controls the future of transportation. So they went to work. They went to the Democratic Republic of Congo and bought up the cobalt mines. They went to South America and Australia and secured the lithium. But mining was only step one. The real choke point is the refining. Today, China processes around 60% of the world's lithium. They refine roughly 70 to 80% of the world's cobalt. They manufacture over 75% of all lithium-ion battery cells on the planet. Let those numbers sink in. If a German automaker wants to build an electric vehicle today, they cannot do it without knocking on Beijing's door. Even if a European car is assembled in Munich, the beating heart of that vehicle, the battery that accounts for up to 40% of its total cost, is Chinese. Europe thought they were transitioning to a clean energy future. In reality, they were trading their reliance on Russian gas for a total, absolute dependence on Chinese batteries. They gave up the monopoly they held for 100 years, only to walk blindly into a monopoly entirely controlled by their greatest geopolitical rival. And now, the trap is springing shut. If you want to see what a modern invasion looks like, don't look at a battlefield. Look at the port of Zeebrugge in Belgium. Right now, there are nearly 80,000 unsold Chinese electric vehicles piled up in European port terminals. They are parked bumper to bumper, turning critical European logistics hubs into giant open-air storage lots for Beijing. This isn't a normal supply chain. This is a siege tactic. China isn't just shipping cars to meet consumer demand. They are aggressively flooding the zone to overwhelm the continent. And European automakers are entirely defenseless against it. Why? Because of the price tag. On average, a Chinese battery electric vehicle imported into Europe is nearly 40% cheaper than a European-produced model. A
A German or French car maker simply cannot build a vehicle for the price that China is willing to sell it. But this is where the West completely misunderstands the threat. European CEOs complain that this is unfair competition. What they fail to realize is that this isn't competition at all. When Volkswagen or Stellantis goes to market, they have to turn a profit to survive. When a Chinese brand like BYD or NIO enters Europe, they are backed by the bottomless treasury of the Chinese Communist Party. For over a decade, Beijing systematically subsidized every single layer of the EV supply chain to achieve scale. They subsidized the mining, the battery factories, and the shipping lines. This allows Chinese automakers to absorb losses that would instantly bankrupt a Western company. The strategy is brutal and simple. Artificially suppress prices, bleed the European legacy automakers of their cash reserves, and force them to close their factories. And the numbers prove it is working. In 2019, Chinese-made vehicles made up barely 1% of electric cars entering Europe. By late 2025, Chinese brands had captured nearly 13% of the entire European EV market, while Chinese-made vehicles altogether accounted for massive portions of total imports. They are suffocating Europe's most important industry, and they are doing it in broad daylight. By late 2024, European leaders finally woke up to the nightmare. As they watched thousands of subsidized Chinese vehicles flood their ports, panic set in. Brussels realized their green revolution was turning into a bloodbath for local industry. So they reached for the only weapon they had left: tariffs. In October 2024, the European Commission voted to slap heavy countervailing duties on Chinese electric vehicles. Depending on the brand, these tariffs climbed as high as 35%, stacked on top of an existing 10% import duty. European politicians took a victory lap, claiming they had built a fortress to protect their automakers. But they didn't build a fortress. They built a picket fence. First, regulators made a glaring oversight. The new massive tariffs strictly targeted fully battery electric vehicles, completely ignoring plug-in hybrids. Chinese automakers instantly pivoted, flooding the European market with highly competitive hybrid models that bypassed the new taxes entirely. But the real fatal flaw in Europe's defense was much bigger. Tariffs only apply to imports. They do not apply to cars built inside your own borders. Instead of fighting the tariffs, Beijing simply walked right through the back door. If the EU wants to tax cars crossing the ocean, China decided they would just build the factories inside the walls. Today, Chinese EV giants are aggressively setting up shop on European soil. BYD is building a massive manufacturing plant in Hungary. Chery Auto is moving into Spain. Leapmotor began manufacturing in Poland. Chinese companies are partnering with local European firms, embedding themselves so deeply into the supply chain that it is becoming impossible to rip them out. This is the ultimate Trojan horse. By bringing capital and jobs to regions hungry for investment, China is turning European member states against each other. Hungary, eager to protect its lucrative new Chinese factories, actively voted against the EU tariffs. The tariffs didn't stop the invasion. They just forced the invaders to set up permanent camps inside the castle. And the worst part? Europe is so dependent on Chinese EVs to meet its own climate targets that the European Commission is already walking back the tariffs, quietly negotiating minimum price agreements just to keep the cars flowing. They are totally trapped. There is a bitter, almost poetic irony to what is happening right now. 30 years ago, European automotive executives flew to Beijing with dollar signs in their eyes. They wanted access to China's massive population and cheap labor. But the Chinese Communist Party had a strict rule. If you want to build cars here, you have to form a joint venture and hand over your manufacturing secrets. Europe happily complied. They traded their engineering blueprints for short-term profits. Today, the tables haven't just turned, they have shattered. Now, European legacy automakers are the ones begging for help. Giants like Volkswagen and Stellantis are forming desperate partnerships with Chinese firms like SAIC and Leapmotor. Why? Because they literally cannot build an affordable, competitive electric vehicle on their own. They need Chinese software, and they need Chinese batteries. But if you think China is returning the favor and sharing their secrets, you are dreaming. Recent investigations into these new Sino-European joint ventures reveal a terrifying reality. China is not transferring its core technology to Europe. When a Chinese battery giant like CATL builds a subsidized megafactory in Spain or Hungary, experts have confirmed there is no long-term skill transfer involved. The intellectual property stays firmly locked away in Beijing. So what is China actually getting out of these deals? They are extracting the last valuable asset Europe has left, its reputation. Chinese brands know that European consumers are still hesitant to buy a car with an unfamiliar badge. But if that exact same Chinese technology is wrapped in European sheet metal, assembled in a European factory, and sold through a traditional European dealership network, the consumer will buy it. China is using legacy European automakers as a Trojan horse within a Trojan horse. They are turning the proudest engineering continent on Earth into a glorified assembly plant for Chinese parts. It is a textbook extortion racket. Hand over your brand or go bankrupt.
If you want to conquer a continent, you don't declare war on all of its countries at once. You find the weakest link, you buy their loyalty, and you let them tear the alliance apart from the inside. For China, that weak link is Hungary. When the European Union finally tried to pass those protective tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in late 2024, the vote wasn't unanimous. It was a fractured, bitter fight. And leading the rebellion against Europe's own survival was Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He publicly claimed the tariffs would start an economic Cold War. But Orban wasn't acting out of deep macroeconomic principle. He was acting as Beijing's paid-for proxy. While Western Europe tried to build walls, Hungary rolled out the red carpet, and China rewarded them handsomely. The Chinese battery giant CATL poured $6 billion into a massive plant in Debrecen. BYD, China's apex EV predator, chose Szeged, Hungary, for its multi-billion-dollar European manufacturing hub. This isn't just regular foreign investment. This is geopolitical bribery. Following the EU tariff vote, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce held a closed-door meeting with its top automakers. They issued a brutal directive: stop all heavy investments in European countries that voted for the tariffs. Punish them. Instead, funnel your cash and factories exclusively into the countries that voted against the tariffs, countries like Germany, and most importantly, Hungary. The strategy is terrifyingly effective. By showering Hungary with billions in infrastructure and jobs, Beijing has effectively purchased a veto vote inside the European Parliament. Whenever Brussels tries to formulate a unified, aggressive stance against Chinese economic espionage or human rights abuses, Hungary steps in to water down the language or block the legislation entirely. Hungary has become a Chinese colony in the heart of the European Union. China doesn't need to defeat Europe's collective defense. They just pay Hungary to unlock the back gate.
If the electric vehicle market is a siege, the European solar industry is a graveyard. When Europe decided to aggressively transition to renewable energy, they imagined a continent covered in European-made solar panels, built by European workers, powering European homes. Instead, they handed Beijing a blank check. Today, a staggering 98% of all solar panels imported into the European Union come directly from China. 98%. How did this happen? It is the exact same playbook used against the auto industry. The Chinese government heavily subsidized its solar manufacturing for a decade, overproduced at a massive scale, and flooded the global market with panels so cheap that no Western company could even buy the raw materials for that price. The results have been devastating. A brutal wave of bankruptcies has swept across Europe's domestic solar sector. Historic companies and startups alike have completely collapsed under the pressure. Legacy manufacturers are slashing jobs and shutting down European production lines because they are bleeding cash and cannot compete with state-sponsored pricing. Europe has effectively lost the ability to manufacture its own solar infrastructure. But the Chinese Communist Party isn't stopping there. The final pillar of Europe's clean energy dream is wind power. Historically, this was Europe's absolute pride and joy. Western giants pioneered the modern wind turbine and dominated the global market. But the winds have shifted. For the first time in history, the top 4 wind turbine manufacturers in the world are all Chinese. Companies like Goldwind and Mingyang are now expanding aggressively into the European market, winning massive contracts by severely undercutting local prices, and even setting up billion-dollar manufacturing hubs right in Europe's backyard. Europe thought the green transition would finally free them from relying on Russian oil and gas. They thought it was a path to energy independence. Instead, they just traded one master for another. They are handing the kill switch for their entire electrical grid over to Beijing.
If you think this is just about manufacturing and economics, you are missing the most terrifying part of the trap. The hardware, the cars, the solar panels, the wind turbines, is just the delivery mechanism. The real weapon is the software. An electric vehicle is not a car, it is a supercomputer on wheels. It is equipped with dozens of external cameras, LiDAR sensors, and constantly listening microphones. When you drive a Chinese EV through the streets of Berlin, Paris, or London, that car is mapping its environment in real time. It syncs with your phone, downloading your contacts, your location history, and your daily routine. Under Chinese law, specifically the 2017 Cybersecurity Law and the 2021 Data Security Law, every single Chinese company is legally obligated to hand over its data to Chinese intelligence services if requested. There is no right to refuse. This means Europe isn't just importing cheap cars. They are subsidizing a fleet of millions of mobile surveillance drones, driving right onto their own military bases, government facilities, and suburban driveways. And the threat to the energy grid is even worse. Every solar panel and battery system requires a component called a power inverter to connect to the local grid. Recently, cybersecurity experts discovered undocumented communication modules. hidden cellular radios embedded inside Chinese-manufactured inverters used in Western solar installations. These shadow components create a secret backdoor that bypasses utility firewalls. This isn't just espionage, it is the capacity for total sabotage. With remote access to millions of inverters across the European continent, Beijing effectively holds a kill switch to the Western power grid. In a geopolitical crisis, they wouldn't need to fire a single missile to plunge Europe into darkness. They could simply send a malicious over-the-air software update and trigger a cascading blackout, shutting down hospitals, financial centers, and military logistics in a matter of seconds. China isn't just selling Europe a green future, they are hardwiring themselves into the nervous system of the West. While Brussels was busy negotiating surrender terms wrapped in weak tariffs, Washington took a sledgehammer to the problem. The United States looked at the thousands of Chinese electric vehicles, the cranes in the ports, and the hidden cellular routers in the solar panels, and realized the threat was no longer economic. It was a matter of sheer national security. The U.S. government didn't just slap a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. They went straight for the brain. Washington finalized a sweeping, unprecedented rule, effectively banning any connected vehicle hardware or software tied to China from operating on American roads. They realized that a 3,000-pound battery-powered supercomputer that reports its geolocation, video feeds, and audio recordings back to Beijing cannot be allowed anywhere near an American military base or a U.S. citizen. But this aggressive American defense strategy has created a massive, fatal fracture in the Western alliance. The United States and Europe are supposed to be an impenetrable bloc, NATO, the transatlantic partnership. But today, the Pentagon looks across the ocean and sees a deeply compromised partner. Think about the logistics of a future conflict. If U.S. troops are stationed in Germany, but the local power grid is run on Chinese inverters, the telecom infrastructure relies on Chinese hardware, and the streets around the base are constantly mapped by Chinese EV cameras, the American military is totally exposed. Washington is practically begging Europe to build a firewall, but Europe refuses. They are too addicted to the cheap green technology. They desperately need the subsidized Chinese solar panels and batteries just to meet their own aggressive, self-imposed climate goals. Europe is actively choosing its emissions targets over its own security, and Beijing is sitting back, watching the greatest military alliance in human history slowly tear itself apart over solar panels and hatchbacks. There is a moment in the collapse of every great empire where the damage becomes irreversible. It is the moment they realize they have outsourced their own survival. For the West, that moment is right now. Empires today do not fall because an invading army marches across their borders. They fall because they hollow out their own foundations. Europe traded a century of engineering dominance for cheap, subsidized batteries. They traded their energy independence for imported solar panels equipped with hidden cellular routers. They thought they were leading a righteous crusade to save the planet. Instead, they sold it to their greatest geopolitical rival. They didn't lose a war, they signed a contract. Think about what happens when the real crisis hits. If a major global conflict erupts tomorrow, whether it is over Taiwan, the South China Sea, or anywhere else, the United States will look across the Atlantic to its oldest, most powerful allies. Washington will demand a united front. They will demand sanctions, blockades, and military support. But what exactly is Europe going to do? Are they going to sanction the country that manufactures their entire public transit system? Are they going to cut ties with the government that controls the lithium in their power grid and the software in their cars? They can't. You cannot fight a war against the country that holds the off switch to your own continent. Europe is no longer an ally in the fight for Western supremacy. They are a hostage. The Green Revolution was supposed to be the West's leap into the future. Instead, it became the ultimate Trojan Horse. And the terrifying truth is that the gates were locked from the inside. The trap is shut. The industrial murder of the West is complete. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think the United States can still save Europe from this trap, or is the continent already permanently lost to Beijing? Let me know your exact thoughts down in the comments, because I read every single one. If you want to understand the real geopolitical moves happening behind the headlines, hit the subscribe button. We don't do mainstream fluff here. We do the truth. I'll see you in the next deep dive.